Welcome to Camp Constitution Radio with your host, Hal Shurtleff. This show is heard on WBCQ The Planet every Monday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on I already said WBCQ The Planet, but say it again. It's a great station, and more people should be aware of it. Anyway, this show is brought to you by Camp Constitution, which, among other things, runs a week and a day long summer camp. At least this year, it will be a week and a day long. As we expand, we hope to have other camps, either week-long camps or weekends, and maybe a winter break camp. The sky's the limit. We just need more help and more support to make these things possible. But this year's camp will take place at the beautiful Toanipi Christian Retreat Center in Ringe, New Hampshire, from July 2nd, that's Sunday afternoon, to July 9th, that's Sunday morning. We have to be out of there by 11 a.m., and the camp is located in the southwest part of New Hampshire, in Ringe, a little rural town, not too far from right on the Massachusetts border. And I know the show is heard around the country and around the world, and we don't expect a whole lot of people coming from China and Africa and other parts of the world, but we do have campers that come and staff that come as far as Florida and Michigan and all around the Northeast and some of the Midwest. And we do make available, if people fly in, we'll pick you up at the airport, drop you off when the camp's over. You can come a day late, leave a day early if needed be. We're very, very flexible about that. And you can find more about that camp program on our website, campconstitution.net. This year we're going to add, we're having an all-star cast, so to speak. We're going to have Alex Newman, writes for the New American Magazine and WorldNet Daily, and just an incredible, brilliant guy. I'm very delighted to add him to our list of featured instructors. We're going to have Mrs. Chris Ann Hall back for her fourth year, and Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America. This will be his first time at camp, and he's very well known. He'll be doing a couple of classes later on in the week. And Professor Willie Soon, who is one of the world's top climate realists. He was a guest on the show. In fact, I think all of the people here were a guest on the show at one point, except maybe Chris Ann Hall, and I got to get her on the show. She's a very busy lady. I don't know if I ever had her on the show, but it will come up. It'll come soon. A lot of things going on in the world, and usually I try to stay with certain topics and not necessarily front-page story news. Problems with North Korea and problems in the Middle East and on. Interesting elections in France. The nationalist movement, and I think it's important to distinguish between nationalism and neo-Nazis or Nazism. It's a whole different world. Love of country is not necessarily a bad thing if that country upholds the values of limited government and protects the rights of its citizens, etc. So to have a love of a country is not. If you loved Stalin's Russia, probably not a good thing. If you loved Hitler's Germany, definitely not a good thing. But to love your country, a country like the United States, and even when you have some bad leaders, and our country's had bad leaders for a long time, you still love the country and the principles and what it could be or what it should be. So England has a nationalist movement. They were able to get out of Brexit, or at least vote to get out of Brexit. Get out of the European Union, they call it Brexit. And it was because people said we've had enough of the internationalists, this notion of no borders, having bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, tell us what's in our best interest and take away our sovereignty, the ability to have something about your own destiny. And as Donald Trump said in his inaugural address, he said something to the effect that you want to be friends with people around the world, but we expect people from other countries to put their country first, and we're going to put our country first, America first. And that's a dirty word, a dirty term to the internationalist. They actually, oh my goodness, they think of goose-stepping and Nazis when they say America first. And there was an America first movement back prior to World War II, kind of a very interesting group of people. Charles Lindbergh was involved in that. And there were a small percentage of American Nazis and a small percentage of communists. And as soon as, because they didn't want us involved in the war, what became what was known as World War II. But as soon as Germany attacked or invaded Russia, all of a sudden, the communists that were actually allied with Hitler all of a sudden said, we need to have a second front now. But the American First leaders, people like Charles Lindbergh, George Eggleston, and many others, they automatically, once war was declared, they completely supported the war effort, and they weren't traitors and treasonous or any of that nonsense. So when a nation is at war, they didn't want a war, but now we're at war, we're volunteering our services. So the term America First, I think, is a good term of what America stands for. I also like to see America First and America protect its own interest. What happened in Syria with the missile attack, I like our current president. I think that was wrong. I think that Assad, not necessarily a great guy, but to his credit, Syria's Assad, he doesn't war against Christians. He doesn't murder them. He doesn't chop their heads off. He doesn't burn down their churches. And he actually protects the small Christian population that's in Syria. And we had no business doing that. And did he use gas against his own citizens? He was winning the war. Why would he do that? He was accused of doing that a few years ago, and we found out that it wasn't. It was the other folks doing it. So I like John Quincy Adams, the Monroe Doctrine that John Quincy Adams wrote. For the most part, basically, we'll keep out of your way, you keep out of our way, and don't mess around in our neighborhood, and we can get along fine. Basically, of course, we became an empire. The United States became an empire back in the Spanish-American War, 1898, and we've never looked back, unfortunately. So there is we have a need for a Navy to keep the sea lanes open so we could trade with other nations. We don't need to have soldiers all over the world and Marines and all over the world. We should get out of NATO. We should get out of Korea, especially NATO. I mean, as soon as possible. With Korea, perhaps I would say phase it out a little bit. The South Korean Army they're some of the toughest soldiers in the world, and they have a good, strong economy. It's not like they really need us there. And we've been there since the Korean War. The Korean War never ended. So the idea of nationalism is not always a bad thing. It's probably a good thing, especially if it's American nationalism or if it's to put the interest of your country first. And if your country adheres to the rule of law and protects the citizens' freedoms, then it's worthy of your love and respect. Also, I want to mention, I was very delighted to hear that there'll be an unveiling of a statue or a bust of the late Dr. Mildred Jefferson in Carthage, Texas. Now, I think she was born in the town right next door. I don't remember the name of that town. And Carthage is, I think it was about 150 miles south of Dallas. And that's going to take place at the school, I think the high school, on May 11th. And I'm so tempted to go down there, but I've got a busy next couple of months, so that's not going to happen. But Dr. Jefferson was a dear friend of mine. She was the first black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. And it was interesting, too. She said that she didn't go to Harvard Medical School to be the first black doctor to graduate. She did it because she wanted to practice medicine. But her claim to fame was that's one of the things, but the other thing was that she was one of the modern founders, of the leaders of the Right to Life movement. And she ended up leaving the position as a surgeon to go into full-time to fight the abortion issue. And she was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known, wonderful sense of humor. She was a little eccentric, which in a good way. She didn't drive. And at her memorial service, there was several of them. Even though she wasn't a Catholic, the Catholic people loved her, and they had a service at a Catholic church just outside of Boston. And it was almost a reunion of her drivers. It was she usually wanted to have men that were big enough that she would feel comfortable if she needed to be defended. So guys that were 6 foot tall or over. And there was one gentleman, we asked who drove Dr. Jefferson the furthest. I didn't drive her around that much. We had her speak at various functions that I was hosting, and I didn't really drive her around a whole lot, a few times around Greater Boston. But there was one gentleman who said, I drove her from Boston to St. Louis. And he said it wasn't a direct drive, too. It was, a 100-mile detour north, heading then another 100-mile detour south, and finally to St. Louis, and then back. It was the same thing. And she didn't like to fly. She felt that if you couldn't be in control of things, she didn't feel comfortable about it. But she was a friend of Larry McDonald, the late congressman who was shot his plane was shot down in the KLL 007. She was very active in Republican politics, and it's quite possible that she played a key role in changing Ronald Reagan's position on the pro-life issue. He was a pro-abortionist. In fact, as governor, he signed the first. It may have been the first or second. I think it was the first law decriminalizing abortion, making abortion legal in California. That was several years before Roe versus Wade. That was in January of 1972. I think it was Governor Rockefeller, New York, and that may have been the second state that decriminalized abortion and made abortion legal. The killing of babies. It's quite a big industry and very lucrative. It's got nothing to do, by the way, with women's right to choose. It has everything to do with population control. In some countries like China, one-child policy, which I guess they've somewhat modified. In a totalitarian state, you can do that. In a country that's supposed to be relatively free, they have to use a different marketing technique. So it's your right to choose. It's a right that was always there from the beginning of the Constitution. It's something it's pre-number, it's something that's in I think it was the 14th Amendment that was not written in there but implied, you see. Incredible. I think it was several Supreme Court. It was a 5-3. No, it was a 6-3 decision. These people who are Supreme Court justices, none of whom were doctors, knew nothing about the medical profession, can tell. And that Roe versus Wade decision was based on a lie, as most people know. Well, maybe most people don't know. The woman who, by the way, became a pro-life activist, Roe, that was her pseudonym. She claimed that she was raped, and while this case was going on, the child was already born, and she wasn't raped. It was a lie. But she became a pro-life activist, and just like there was a doctor. I'm trying to think of his name. There's a Dr. Needleson. He was one of the people testifying at Congress promoting abortion. He was a doctor that committed abortions, and he came up with this figure of how many back alley botched abortions there were. That was one of the biggest reasons why people, they're going to have it anyway. You might as well make it legal. And he said it was a lie. Yeah, Dr. Nathanson, I think. He has a video out about it. It should be on YouTube. But he said we lied. We just made it up. We just made the numbers up. But hey, so Dr. Jefferson, she said her job as a doctor was to protect life, not to take it, and especially people that maybe not be perfect. She said that wasn't what it was about. And I recommend you just go on YouTube. There's some videos of her speeches. She had an incredible speaking voice. She was a woman, a slight, petite lady, but a giant in respect. You listen to her voice. One time she told me that there was this books on tape that wanted to ask if she would read, do a couple of books. And these are all white people, of course, these condescending whites. And they said, well, Dr. Jefferson, we decided against it because you don't sound black enough. Can you imagine that? So what is a black supposed to sound like, and here are these white liberals stereotype. I guess you have to have a certain sound to your voice to be considered black. It was amazing. And Dr. Jefferson, interesting, she did not have a hateful bone in her body, even though she was vilified. And people who vilified her most were Republican conservatives. The liberals hated her. The Democrats had no use for her. She was off the plantation. She wasn't promoting the leftist causes, so they didn't. But she was a conservative. She may have had a few neocon leanings, but she was a true blue patriot, and the Republican Party should have embraced her. She ran for the U.S. Senate in Massachusetts. They wanted nothing to do with her. They didn't like her. She was too brilliant, and she wasn't going to play their game. She was her own woman. And if you're not a machine Republican or a machine Democrat, you're not going to get the blessings of the, cursings of the party. And so she never was successful politically, but that's not what God put her on earth for. She would speak around the country, and if the date was clear, she would do it. She'd never charge you a dime, never accept any money. Just drive her to pick up her groceries or drive her to the hair salon or what have you. And she came to Camp Constitution as a speaker. I think it was 2012. It was quite possibly her last public appearance, or at least her last speaking engagement. And it was that would have been in the summer. And the first time I looked at her, I thought she's not on all cylinders. I never realized how old she was because she just had so much a spark of life to her. She was in the early 80s when she passed away, and I was just shocked. I couldn't believe. I never thought of her. I'm thinking she's in her 60s. She's older than I am, but my goodness, never thought about an age. And she was supposed to speak at the State House in Massachusetts in September. And I called her to pick her up, and she said, I'm not really up to it. I really want to be there, but I can't make it. And I said, okay, Doc. And then she died about, maybe a month or two later. I think she had cancer, and she just didn't tell too many people about it, so it came as a bit of a surprise. And one of the sad things is she left her papers to Harvard University. And I say it's sad. It was her alma mater, and it was her wishes. And there is you can go to the Harvard Library, the Harvard go and see her papers and her effects, but it's limited access. It's not going to be put on. You're not going to be able to, like Sam Blumenfeld's archives that we have for Camp Constitution. It's not going to be up there. So it's too bad. But her legacy lives on, and you can still see a lot of her videos on YouTube and some of her writings. She had a couple of unpublished books, and I would have loved to be able to get them. I don't think they'll ever be published now that Harvard has the rights to them. And Harvard has absolutely no interest in promoting her. But I'm delighted that she's being honored in her hometown. I don't think she's very well known. It was interesting at her funeral was down in Texas, but she adopted Massachusetts. She spent a lot of time. She brought her parents up and bought a house for them way back when in the 70s. And so she really loved Massachusetts. And as I said, she didn't have a hateful bone in her body. Even, the people against her, the pro-abortion people, she would debate them. She never lost her cool. She usually had, and she was loyal to her friends. She was just very devoutly loyal to her friends. And, she was traveling certain circles, and if a name came up, maybe this person. There was a congressman, a Democrat congressman in Massachusetts, and she saw him do something when he was a young man, and she had a lot of respect for him, even though he was a liberal and he was wishy-washy on abortion. She still had kind words to say about him, and she was the consummate Christian woman, and I'm very pleased that. And if you go to my Facebook page, you'll see me with a picture of her next to me. That was probably in the early '90s. Hal Shurtleff. So that's not my wife. That's the late Dr. Jefferson. And anyway, I was very, very honored and pleased to know this fine and great woman. Which leads me to another topic, and the topic of slavery. And Reverend Kraft, the Camp Constitution is having some speaking engagements with Reverend Kraft. And we had him on the show not too long ago to discuss this book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense, which we reprinted. Reverend Kraft wrote the foreword, or not the foreword. I think he wrote a foreword to this most recent. The book, which is really only about 80 pages long, it was written by a former black communist by the name of Manning Johnson, who left the Communist Party when he realized it was a racist entity and had no interest in the black community. And he went back to his Christian roots, and he died shortly thereafter. Actually, our little reprint has also, in addition to the Color, Communism, Common Sense, the transcripts of his speech before he was killed. And some people thought he might have been murdered, and others thought it was a car accident. And unfortunately, accidents do happen, but they're not always. So he probably wasn't murdered. Although I think it was legitimate to think that because he was going out exposing the Communist Party and not too popular around those kinds of folks. But nevertheless, so Reverend Kraft's going to be on a speaking tour in Boston in May, this coming May. And we're going to have him speak in the inner city of Boston, as well as central Massachusetts and suburb of Boston, Dedham, Massachusetts, on the topic of how our nation's enemies promote racism to destroy our country. They would love to see a race war. They would love to see blacks and whites and Hispanics hate each other. And it doesn't take a whole lot to do that. And I bore witness to this while I was living. I used to live in a section of Boston called Hyde Park, which is just a short distance from where I am now. But during the height of forced busing in the 70s, the federal government said, Boston schools, you have desegregation, even though people who live in your neighborhoods, if it's a predominantly white neighborhood, the school is going to be mostly white. If you're in a black neighborhood, it's going to be mostly black. And that's the way people seem to want it. That's why people bought homes in Hyde Park or Rosendale or South Boston, because they want to be near a school. So the benevolent federal government says, you can't do this. We have to experiment. You see, black children can't learn as well with other blacks. They have to be in a school with whites. The reason being, in 1954, it was demonstrated that black girls would prefer to play with white dolls and black dolls, and this was terrible. So we have to desegregate and all this baloney. And it caused so much race hatred and division. And where there's racism will be with mankind as long as we live in a fallen state. You're not going to eradicate it, and you can't smash it. You have to fight it you have to understand, if you're made in God's image, you know that racism is a sin, because what you're saying is that I don't like some of God's creation. But our nation's enemies are very good at getting people to hate each other. And I had a recent I had Reverend Bruce Wall on the show a few weeks ago, discussing a issue in his neighborhood and how Agenda 21 policies. Well, he's not quite up on the bigger picture on that issue, but still, it's gentrification. And I was posting on his Facebook page. He was contemplating run for office, and one of his friends, who was a retired policeman, a black man, was posting things. And one thing led to the next thing you know, we're getting into a full-fledged debate on the slavery issue. And I mentioned that our founders, the First Amendment, did not set up the First Amendment wasn't designed to keep people who are Christians out of political office. It just simply said that Congress, it will not establish a religion. There'll still be no state religion. That doesn't mean that Christians can't run for office. That doesn't mean that you can't say God bless you if you're sitting there as a congressman, or promote godly values. It's just that you can't have a denomination. And at the time the First Amendment was passed, most states had state churches. Massachusetts had the Congregational Church. That was the state church. Now, I'm not in favor of state churches, and it took a while, but within 30 to 40 years, most states realized this wasn't the way to go, and they stopped supporting state churches. That's something that Europe had and still has in some cases. So anyway, so then he gets into he shows me a link to a colonial law, and he's somehow saying that Massachusetts colonial law, which a very Christian statement, but he said something about the militia was set up to capture slaves and to set up a slave state. And I think, what is this guy talking about? I didn't quite understand what he mean. Two people can look at the same facts and draw different conclusions. In fact, he mentioned the LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson Amendment in the early 50s to apply this 501c3 tax code to churches. And in his opinion, it was designed to silence the black churches. Well, I look at that and it says, well, I don't know if he was silencing black churches. He was trying to silence conservative churches that criticized Johnson. Johnson was a New Deal liberal socialist, and his biggest enemies were Christians who disagreed with his socialist positions. And I don't think he was trying to squash the black churches, at least the liberal black churches, the ones that are promoting, the causes that he was promoting. Maybe there was a few examples of conservative black churches being silenced, but I've never heard of, I may be wrong, but I've never heard of the IRS going after a liberal church. And when I say liberal church, most of the black churches, and Reverend Kraft and I have discussed this, they're theologically sound. They might be. I mean, I have my own. I lean more Calvinist, so I may not say that a particular church is sound according to Calvinists, but by and large, they're Trinitarian. They believe the Word of God. They believe that we're created and what have you. But they promote left-wing causes. They support left-wing politicians who oppose everything that church is supposed to stand for, and that's just something that's hard to understand. But that's the reality. Anyway, so he's getting into it. He's referring to the United States as he said, basically it was a Holocaust and raped and murdered and abused, and so I try to point out that slavery is something that was not unique to the United States. It's something that's been around since the fall of man, that they practiced slavery, and the Roman Empire practiced it. And I pointed out, too, that it was the Muslims that introduced slavery into Africa. And I made reference to George Schuyler. Now, George Schuyler was a brilliant black journalist, a former socialist that became a liberty-minded man, and his daughter Philippa Schuyler, a concert pianist genius who was killed in Vietnam, another topic. But I actually found a debate. I was so delighted to find this debate on YouTube between George Schuyler, Malcolm X, James Baldwin, the author, and Professor Eric Lincoln, who was a writer, a black man, a writer, professor, and he wrote a few books on the black Muslims. I have one of his books. I was familiar with him. The debate took place in the early 60s, and here's Malcolm X, the white man. And Malcolm X was a very intelligent man. He was a very bright guy. There's no question about it. And he was talking about white slavery, and Schuyler said it was the Muslims that introduced slavery into Africa. And he mentioned a slave trader. He said there's a statue to him. Tupatai, I think I can't get his name right. I was doing some research before the show began. Here was a man that had a slave empire, and there's a statue to his name, a black man who was a Muslim. And the average people don't even know about this. They don't know. They buy into it. Whites and blacks buy into it. And of course, most of the anti-slavery societies were in the South, and Virginia, for example, which was a slave state, but it abolished the slave trade before any other state did. Massachusetts was the first state to do away with slavery at the state constitution, although you had to go into court and the judge had to, declare you free. And there weren't that many slaves in Massachusetts compared to some of the southern states. But within a short time, within maybe 20 or 30 years, many of the states under the Constitution they abandoned slavery. And I think it's too bad the rest of the country didn't follow suit. And the problem, we look at the Old Testament and even the New Testament, where slavery is upheld, but it's a type of slavery. The slavery that was practiced in the South was chattel slavery, and it was a permanent slave for the most part. There were some blacks that got their freedom, yes, no question about that. But in the Old Testament, a slave would be free would be set free every 6 years. And most of the slavery is slave. In some cases, you sold yourself into slavery. It was called a debt slavery, and it was a different style of slavery. And so that's the problem. And this is what happened. Christianity abolished slavery in Europe by, 1000 AD. It was completely done away with. But you see, during the Renaissance, people had itching ears. They started looking at the Greek, looking at Aristotle, and Aristotle said that there was a certain groups of people where slavery is their natural condition and it's in their best interest. Well, that sounds like that's what we want to hear. So it was reintroduced. So it's a thing that will, of course, will divide. It was running out of time here. Boy, this is the fastest 30. I think we'll pick this up, and I'll have Reverend Kraft on hopefully next week. And we're going to be at the Mass Hope Homeschool Show next weekend in Worcester, Massachusetts. So if you're a homeschooler and you live in the New England region, stop by our table. Until then, God bless you, and thank you for listening. You're listening to WBCQ, The Planet.